back to the Witches Found episodes on the Missing Witches podcast. Oh, Amy, this week you sat back down with one of our favorites.
One of our, I don't want to say most successful. I don't know if it's got the largest number of downloads, but it certainly had one of the biggest reactions. Was way back just after season 1. We went to a lab and spoke to a coven of witches who operate scientifically out of a lab. And we had so many, I'm using air quotes here, science witches reach out to us and say, oh my goddess, I feel alone no longer.
I feel so heard.
Yes, very heard. And the leader of this coven was, and ever shall be, WhiteFeather Hunter, and one of the most fascinating people probably that I've ever met in person, I would say. Such
a fun thinker. Also such a fun person to hang out with.
Such a fun person. and we're going to talk about vampires and life and death and all kinds of incredible, brave, witchy science. Witchy science, everybody. Witchy science. So, WhiteFeather Hunter, Aniba.
You aren't being a proper woman, therefore you must be a witch. You must be a witch.
Well, here I am. It's the full moon.
It's the full moon. I'm so happy to be talking to you tonight. I can see it through my window shining down on us as we speak.
Amazing.
So amazing. So, WhiteFeather, we're so close to Halloween now. I'm going to let you go off on your full moon tangents, but first I want to talk about, you told me a little while ago that you submitted a paper to the Journal of Dracula Studies. So can we please start with the Journal of Dracula Studies?
Right. So this is a legit academic journal.
Mm-hmm.
There is actually a field called Dracula Studies. And it just so happens that they issued a call for a special edition on witches.
Ooh.
So I will be submitting to that journal. Their deadline's January 1st. So I haven't submitted it yet. I'm still working on it. I'm still working through my ideas. And those will be some of the ideas that I throw out there tonight for all of the listeners.
Get ready for some Dracula adjacent ideas. Now, is it like a literary journal? Is it focused on like the novel Dracula or like the mythology of vampires?
Yeah, Bram Stoker's, the whole gamut. And right. I found it so interesting that they decided to do a special issue on witches, but I guess it makes sense since, there's been such a revival of witchiness in popular culture lately.
Yes, and I spoke to one woman and I asked her if she was a witch, and she sort of thought about it for a minute, and then she said, I think I'm more spooky than witchy. I think I'm more haunted than witchy. Ooh. And I think they're very related, haunted, spooky, witchy.
They can be, for sure. And, there is also a whole field of philosophy called hauntology.
Get into that, please.
Yeah. It's not a philosophy that I have had the opportunity to dive into too much because I've been busy with art philosophy mainly. But yeah, it's just looking at metaphysical stuff that's maybe disembodied. I can't actually give you a definition for it because it's not my field of research.
Then how about this? Do you believe in ghosts?
I've seen ghosts.
Can you tell me about that?
I have had an experience, actually it was around this time of year.
When the veil is at its thinnest.
Of course. Mm-hmm. I had a fetch appear to me, a ghost that is referred to as a fetch. And a fetch comes and appears to let you know that someone close to you has died.
Oh.
Yeah. And so the fetch that appeared to me was at the end of my apartment hallway. Just for a flash of a second, there was a woman in a black veil and a black dress. And it was that split second, you see something out of the corner of your eye and you go, what the fuck was that?
Mm-hmm.
And I found out the next day that I had lost a friend to suicide.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So the fetch came to prepare me, I guess.
Yeah, and it's something that a lot of people would have just brushed off and thought that it was a piece of dust in the light in their eye or something. But the witch sees things, I think, more for what they are.
Absolutely. And just being open to the possibility of maybe there was something there.
Yes, the great maybe. I love living inside that great maybe.
Yeah, and that great maybe is something that I'm having a really tricky time negotiating right now in my research, because I'm working between witchcraft and science, and science. Yeah, science, we have been trained to believe has all of the answers or seeks to have the answers. And sometimes, in some people's minds, that doesn't leave a whole lot of room for mystery or believing in the unseen or what have you, when there's sort of an obsession with proof. So,
yes.
Yeah, some things just can't be proven, or some things, we witches don't necessarily need to be proven.
Mm-hmm.
It's a tricky negotiation.
And how do you navigate that in your own experience?
Well, I can tell you, working in the lab and working with scientific experimentation, exclusively scientific experimentation, there are a lot of things that are extremely abstract and become this blanket of data, which can be interpreted in different ways, depending on what you apply to the data. And these things get constructed into what is presented as a truth. What constitutes proof may sort of be subjective, although science hopes to be objective. It's just can't be the case all the time. And we're human, and everything has our human interpretation. So, yeah, I would always be a little bit wary of things that are presented as the absolute truth or scientifically proven.
Because when you're working in the lab, there has to be a certain level of precision, because when you're experimenting, you need to replicate.
I mean, you can attempt precision, but when you're working with life, life's messy and life's unpredictable, and you can aim towards precision, but there are so many different variables that can skew that precision, and then you just have to work with what you have. So, yeah.
And you specifically work very much with what you have. You've worked with your own blood, your own tissue. Can you get into that a little bit?
You really want to go there now?
Speaking of Dracula, let's talk about blood just for a minute.
Are you ready to go there?
Yes.
So my science-based practice is in tissue culture and tissue engineering. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with what that is, it's essentially growing mammalian cells in a petri dish, caring for them, in an incubator, feeding them nutrient fluid, watching them grow, observing their morphology, which is their shape, their characteristics, and often counting cells. And I spend a lot of time counting millions and millions and millions of cells to collect data. And this is the specific technique that is used or which they hope to use to grow meat,
yes,
to produce lab-grown meat. It's also called clean meat, and it's also called cellular agriculture. So tissue culture relies very much on the animal industry still. Cells need proteins and other nutrients in order to be able to grow that are currently derived from a standardized form of fetal calf serum. And fetal calf serum is blood from the heart of a fetal calf that is extracted while it's still in its mother. So it's bled to death while it's still in its mother. And the startup community that's promoting lab-grown meat They are hoping to gain more investor dollars and develop this as an industrially scalable product, are presenting it within all of these frameworks of, ecological green, cruelty-free, animal-free, even vegan, quote unquote, clean meat. And, when you work in tissue culture, that as of yet, there's still no way to culture mammalian cells without the fetal calf serum. I've been doing some experiments in the lab recently where I'm growing cells in human serum instead. And this is where we get into the vampire study stuff.
Yeah. It's like Frankenstein meets Dracula.
Yeah, so human serum is available from laboratory supply companies. It's interestingly only available from males. So this is something that I found really interesting, and I was looking into it a little bit, and it's a problem because how can you test for physiologically female-specific diseases using human male serum? It's it presents all kinds of sort of variables that can skew results, and
as a great demonstration of how patriarchy has ignored women's and
health issues
and health and yeah. So
I mean, it fits into all of that.
How is it harvested if it's taken from fetal cows for the bovine? How is it harvested from humans?
Well, nobody's being stabbed in the heart, that's for sure.
In utero, yeah.
It would be acquired the same way any blood donation would be acquired.
Okay.
Just an intravenous, yeah.
I'm confused as to why this would be other than just abject patriarchal chauvinism. Like, why do they only use men's?
Well,
I'm just baffled here. I'm so confused.
Yeah, well, there's one argument that male blood is a good baseline because females have hormonal fluctuations. So it's more difficult to standardize, but we know that men also have hormonal fluctuations.
Right.
Interestingly, when blood donations are taken, blood is categorized differently according to sex or gender. And part of the reason for that is because when you're giving a blood transfusion, there is a specific disease that can be fatal if it's blood that was taken from a woman who has ever been pregnant, and there are certain antibodies present. So that can be a problem. But when we're talking about laboratory experiments and you're just growing cells or, testing for diseases, this isn't a concern. This is not a blood transfusion.
Right.
And I don't profess to have all of the knowledge on this issue because I've only started researching this recently. And, I've just been working on this research over the last 9 months, probably. Mm-hmm. So I'm still discovering things, and the experimentation that I will eventually be doing when I go back to Australia.
Yes, you spend a lot of time in Australia.
Yeah, well, I'm doing my PhD at the University of Western Australia, mm-hmm. and it's a unique PhD in that it's a cross-enrollment between the School of Design and the School of Human Sciences. So it's a little bit like doing 2 PhDs in one. I have to produce a body of artistic work, but I also have to produce some scientific data that, could be published in a scientific journal. So the experiments that I decided to do that sort of bridge those two worlds, and I'll explain a little bit more how it touches into the art world. But I decided, well, what if I grow some mammalian cells from my own blood? And what if I can use my own blood that's easier to access, that's non-invasive, where I don't have to stick needles into myself? And so I decided to see if anyone has ever tried to grow cells in menstrual blood.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I can see in all of the journal publications that I've looked through, nobody ever has. And it's...
I'm surprised that no one has. This is a steady supply. And you, as you say, non-invasive. Is it just because women have just not been as present in labs in the past as they are today, that this hasn't happened already?
I would wager a guess that it has something to do with the taboo nature of menstrual blood.
Sure.
There's been, when I looked at research that has been done using menstrual blood, it's mainly been used as a source of multipotent stem cells. So it's full of stem cells. And of course, this is the most non-invasive way that you could get stem cells as well, because typically stem cells have to come from umbilical cord blood.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a little bit of research, just, not a whole lot, but a little bit of research looking at sourcing stem cells from menstrual blood. And very, very recently, just last year, a scientific paper came out that it was a woman researcher who was working on this research. And she and her team discovered that menstrual blood actually will speed up the healing process of an open wound.
So menstrual blood is like a healing elixir, and we're so divorced from our own bodies that we don't even know this? Is that what you're telling me, WhiteFeather?
Exactly. It's exactly what I'm telling you.
Okay, I'm having a mind explosion. I mean, I recently had my a uteral ablation because I was bleeding so heavily that it just wasn't worth keeping my uterus going as it was. But
Right.
now I wish I had done some harvesting when I had the chance.
Yeah, seriously, I don't know if it's the presence of the stem cells. I would have to read through that study a little bit more closely to see if they have actually figured out why it speeds up the healing process. It may be that it's the stem cells that are present. I'm not sure. It may be that the nutrients that are present in menstrual blood feed your own cells what they need to do skin repair. I'm not sure. But the research is there that shows that there are living cells in menstrual blood, and it contains nutrients that help with skin repair. So, the combination of these two things leads me to believe that it could very well support the growth of cells in a petri dish. This starts to touch on ideas of cannibalism. If we're talking about lab-grown meat, what if we grow meat using menstrual blood?
It's human meat, for sure. But what does that mean? Yeah.
But is it human meat?
I don't know. You tell me.
Well, if we're growing animal muscle tissue using menstrual blood, is it human meat or is it animal meat?
Well, listeners, what do you think? Email us at missingwitches. I mean, so this is the project that you're working on. What do you imagine manifesting as like the quote unquote like art project, the product of this thesis?
So the privilege that I have as an artist is that the scientific research that I do will always contain an element of cultural critique. And so the cultural critique that is inherent in this work is around the materiality of what I'm working with. Okay, let's just get one thing straight. I'm not planning to propose to make clean meat from menstrual blood for the masses to consume. This is actually a gesture. This is a gesture that's meant to instigate some cultural conversation around, well, what actually is in clean meat? What's the materiality of cellular agriculture? And have people thinking critically and having a discussion about this. Because I think that there's a tendency for, we're all really stressed out about the end of the world. And we all feel guilty as humans. We're destroying the planet and we want solutions. And this need to find a solution to save the planet, I think makes us a little bit vulnerable to, being so hopeful when we see something that's presented as a solution.
Yes.
That we don't necessarily think about it critically. And one of the things that we need to think about critically is that solutionism right now is embedded within a capitalist framework. And, I'm thinking back to a previous podcast. I think it was where you and Risa were having a conversational, like a chat, just the two of you. And I think she just kind of like slipped it in there that as witches, you're anti-capitalist as fuck. And I just want to echo that, because I think that I've been reading a lot about the history of witchcraft and how it coincides with, the very beginning stages of capitalism. And those two things are very intricately intertwined.
Yes. There's a great book that maybe you've read. It's very short, called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses by Barbara Ehrenreich. Anyway, I'll put it in the show notes.
And Deirdre English, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the one.
That's was sort of one of the texts that I started out with.
For those of you who are listening, it's very accessible. Again, I'll put it in the show notes because it's a quick read, but it's an important read. Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Yeah. And, it's sort of, I call it an ovulatory text from second wave feminism. And I call it an ovulatory text because I don't want to say it's a seminal text. Okay, because a seminal text refers to semen, and it refers to, an original idea. And for me, when you compare semen to ova, and the amount of semen compared to the amount of ova, I would tend to think that the ova would be more of an original idea. I guess I would.
I think the authors of the book would feel very, very good about that.
I was thinking that maybe I could read through some of the text that I've been working on.
Oh, yes, please do.
I should also mention that two other texts that are really, really important in unpacking the connections between the advent of witchcraft, demonological witchcraft, and capitalism are written by Silvia Federici.
For sure.
Absolutely essential reading. Her first text is called Caliban and the Witch.
Yes.
And this is quite a dense text, but she published another one, sort of a follow-up or an update to that, where she revisits a lot of things, but it's sort of a more easily digestible text. It's not as dense. And it's called Witches, Witch Hunting, and Women. So she's been informing a lot of what I've been writing about. And I feel that she really sort of picks up the thread that Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English laid out there. They said, okay, here you go, feminists, follow this up. And she was the one who answered that call and followed it up. So I would say those are essential texts.
And now you are picking up the thread from there and taking it where? Keep going on this journey.
I'm taking it into technology, high tech, and biotechnology specifically. First, I want to talk a little bit about deviance.
I'm sorry. It's just that next week our listeners are going to hear my interview with Backwash, an amazing MC. I know you're also a fan, and her latest record is called Deviancy. So this word has been ringing and ringing and ringing and ringing and ringing through my consciousness and my sort of the zeitgeist right now. So I just needed to mark that moment of deviancy and deviance. Please carry on.
All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about deviant pathways. And witches gain access to protected spaces through deviant pathways, twisted beings that they are believed to be. So I'm asking the question, are they twisted to begin with, or have they become distorted through the necessity for such navigational means? And so deviance is broadly defined as the fact or state of diverging from usual or accepted standards, especially in social or sexual behavior. Legally, deviance is nestled within the realms of formal criminal behavior, specifically behavior that destabilizes social structural solidarity. And what that means in particular is the solidarity of a capitalist system. So these behaviors are seen to violate, what's considered quote unquote objective standards of adequate performance and moral duty of the good and virtuous life of reason. Okay, and this is actually an excerpt that I took from a text that was talking about how capitalism is the only moral social structure. Yeah. However, sociology theory sees deviance not only as a potential for criminality, but also as very much as an integral part of society where change and innovation intersect. And so in this way, deviance is culturally relative, and therefore it's mutable over time. And it can instigate cultural shifts as well as an adaptive method through acts of rebellion. And so this is where I'm interested in the witch and deviance. Within criminology theory, you have a theory called strain theory. And strain theory says that deviant paths make their way in response to obstacles. And these obstacles are in the form of societal pressures or strains. And so these pressures or strains cause us to deviate our path in order to work around them and gain access to whatever endpoint we're trying to get to. So you may have heard of another kind of deviant pathway that is sort of within landscaping and transportation planning terminology, and it's called a desire path.
Desire path.
Desire paths are these little dirt trails, these little erosion artifacts that you see on the ground that actually reflect human and also non-human agency in deviating away from the prescribed pathways.
Oh, so like you'll see a track across a boulevard cutting the
Exactly.
corner. Right.
Exactly.
Desire paths?
Those are desire paths. So it's when someone ignores the sidewalk because they are looking to find the way that is the easiest movement between access points.
Yes.
Entry point and exit point. And so I believe that deviance this way can be positioned within sociality and social or public structures as a product of both resistance and desire, specifically with regards to access and limitations.
And that's so witchy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Did you know that chimneys in houses used to actually be intentionally built with a bend in them? And this is called the witch's crook. So that the witch couldn't get down the chimney and come into the house.
That's the only reason?
Yes. I mean, how did they expect Santa Claus to get in? I don't know.
Santa Claus is a witch too, I think so.
I think so.
That's a story for a Yuletide episode.
So, I mean, there's a whole, I don't want to get into the history of the witch hunts, but there's a whole history around peasant women rebelling against all of these restrictions and limitations that were placed on them with the advent of capitalism. And so they were considered socially deviant for attempting to work around these structures, or just being victims of these newly imposed structures. And the one that they talk about in Witches, Midwives, and Nurses is the professionalization of the medical industry.
Yes.
And how that development, that professionalization, I guess, disenfranchised women lay healers. The witch, and we're coming back to witches in labs here, the witch plying her craft in the academic laboratory is a contaminant. And so what Barbara Ehrenreich and Deirdre English were talking about in their book, what they say is that, quote, the witch hunts left a lasting effect. An aspect of the female has ever since been associated with the witch, and an aura of contamination has remained. So what contamination is this? What are they talking about? They provide the specific context of layperson versus professional. So this is their critical assessment of how situated knowledges of folk medicine that were provided to the poor were historically suppressed to promote this newly developing, rarefied, licensed medical service, mainly for the upper class.
Yes, because of course the witch was providing these services. There was usually some form of exchange, but it was community care. It was
absolutely,
at being taken care of in your time of need and taken care in your time of less need, until, like you say, the difference between the layperson and the professional is the professional gets paid. That's the difference, right? And has to go to school, but has to go to a certain school and has to apply to that certain school and has to pay to go to that school, and so on and so on and so on and so on.
Exactly. So they explain in their book that a gradual takeover unfolded. And this was part of a, quote, political and economic monopolization of medicine. And so this monopolization happened through this establishment of the professional categorization. And what they're saying is that this layperson designation increasingly and predominantly was assigned to the common female healer. And these are the colloquial old wives. They were prohibited from entering the fledgling academic institutions because socially it wasn't acceptable, but there were also financial obstacles, obviously. And therefore, they're denied the license to practice as what was known as regular doctors. And so the contamination that they're talking about is the contamination of the layperson. And the layperson is the autonomous lower class practitioner that was made more disreputable through some suspected association with witchcraft. This was what was promoted. And she was left precariously squatting at the boundary of what would become conventional authorized medicine. And this is what we take for granted now as the absolute truth.
That which has been authorized.
Exactly. So I was interested in, the history of witchcraft as an anti-capitalist resistance. And what Sylvia Federici gets into is that there were peasant uprisings that happened, as land was being taken away, as it was being put towards industrial use, as people were being displaced and caused to be homeless, particularly elder women. This is all stuff that we already sort of know in the backs of our minds, but she gives a really, really precise timeline on that. So interestingly, in Federici's new book, she just very briefly touches on the topic of biotechnology and the relationship of biotechnology to women's bodies. And it's a summary statement, really. And she just states that the attack on women comes above all from capital's need to destroy what it cannot control and degrade what it most needs for its reproduction. And throughout her book, she's talking about women's reproductive capacity as, providing new labor for the labor force. So that's what she's referring to here. Capitalism's need to control reproduction. She goes on to say that this is the body of women, for even in the age of super automation, no work and no production would exist except for what is the result of our gestation. And I don't necessarily agree with that. But what she says is that test tube babies do not exist. This is a discursive formula that we should reject as an expression of a masculine search for procreation outside the female body, which is the one frontier capital has yet to conquer. Silvia Federici is a very well-respected expert and scholar, on the history of witchcraft. But it's really interesting to me that she decides to put this one little paragraph at the very end of her book. And so for me, that's my prompt. That's my prompt.
I was about to say, this almost seems like a challenge specifically directed at you, WhiteFeather Hunter.
Yes. Well, what I don't agree with in her statement is the sort of second wave feminist essentialism.
Yes.
Because women are not just their bodies. And I take a much more intersectional, inclusive look at womanhood, femininity, also fertility. And I think that, I showed a little bit when I was talking about creating transgender blood by adding estrogen to what is considered or categorized as physiologically male blood, that there's a lot of complexity there, and we can't just make such a polemic statement, I guess.
Yeah. And
in terms of biotechnology,
yeah.
Because biotechnology is enabling a lot of wonderfully fuzzy boundaries, and it's allowing us to explore a non-binary reality. So, I guess that's something that I would address with what she's saying here. But I love that she has sort of left this prompt. Now, what I'm interested in looking at in terms of contemporary witchcraft and biotechnology is how the old taint still remains.
Yeah.
And that is the taint of layperson versus, so-called professional.
Yes, I still have people claim to me that the scientist is the opposite of witch. And
which is absolutely
I've done
false.
my best. Yeah, I've done my best here, people. Just like I think, the witch is the great experimenter, and so is the scientist. To me, there's so much overlap. And I would suggest that our listeners, if you haven't already, it's the Imbolc special from this year where we first met up with WhiteFeather and the Witches of the Lab at Concordia. So please go back and listen to that episode. We get into a lot of these issues in that episode too. So carry on, WhiteFeather.
Okay, so the old taint.
Yes.
The non-professional practitioner is now vexing the practices of female or femme and non-binary arts practitioners and activists whose hands-on training and critical applications of these advanced technologies have and continue to be, but really drastically have been undervalued and mistrusted and met with very little reward. And one example that I can give you of an art project that was attempting to sort of confront this head on is called Kiss My R's. Kiss My R's addresses the misogyny that has been present in the largest art, science, and technology festival in the world, Ars Electronica. So it happens in Austria every year, in Linz. Other than the fact that this was a feminist act of resistance, and I'll tell you a little bit more about what this project was about in a moment. So I'm going to get back into some witch hunt history here for a second.
Yeah, please do.
So during this early period of the European witch hunts, the Inquisitor instruction manuals, such as one called the Compendium Maleficarum, which is from 1608, established that part of a witch's pact with the devil was the right of kissing his, and I'm quoting from a book called Witches in Print. This is an independent chapbook publication that I just got in the mail from Snakehair Press. So shout out to Snakehair Press.
Yeah, we'll link in the show notes.
The witch's pact with the devil involved, quote, kissing his posterior, the osculum infame, also called the kiss of shame because it was regarded as an act of abasement. In light of this legacy of kissing the devil's ass, one might surmise that the contemporary expression kiss my ass is a direct reference to such witchy behavior as this demonic butt licking. And more commonly, the softer expression kissing arse, as well as a suggestion to do so, appears in numerous historical cultural references of the time period as a crude behavior that's associated with devils, curses, and magical formulas. And this goes all the way back to the mid-1500s.
So kiss my ass is a witch thing.
Very much so.
And then, so what's this project with this festival in Austria?
So Kiss My Ars it's riffing on the name Ars Electronica, obviously, but this was a social media campaign that was instigated by some really amazing feminist bio artists. Two of them I know, Heather Dewey Hagborg and Kathy High. I really recommend checking out their work.
Again, we'll link all of this in the show notes.
And so Ars Electronica, I believe, is, as a festival, it's about 40 years old now. And they looked through the history of Ars Electronica and saw that 90% of the time, the awards were given to men.
Not uncommon in any environment, sadly.
So this is a really interesting merging of sexism in both the art world and the technology high-tech world.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we're all well aware of the fact that Silicon Valley is rife with sexism. It may sort of be passing into recent history now, but not so much, that the art world is also often very male elitist. If you look at sort of all of the most well-recognized artists, they're typically male. I mean, that's what the Guerrilla Girls were all about.
Mm-hmm.
Fabulous Guerrilla Girls. So Ars Electronica is like the culmination of sexism in these two worlds. And so Kiss My Ars was a really, I'm not sure if it went viral or not, but it was a really strong social media campaign to bring attention to this fact and to just, you know, call them out. And I think they were quite successful because last year, the Starts Prize, which is one of the prizes that Ars Electronica gives out to projects that, again, are presenting some kind of solutionism, but, you know, they're innovative projects. They're prize-winning innovative projects. So last year's winning project was called Future Flora, and it was a kit to cultivate your own vaginal flora to heal your infections.
Oh,
And that was Juliana Tomasello was the artist who designed that Future Flora kit. So as of last year, we do see women's bodies and, women's medical concerns beginning to enter this very masculinist tech art and technology festival. And so she did win a prize. My criticism, however, is that this is still situated within this capitalist framework of innovation and solutionism.
Products for purchase.
I was just going to say that, yeah. So the difference, for me is that as a witch working as an anti-capitalist, is that my rituals are process-based versus product-based. This is a very deliberate action. I am not interested in producing anything that can be industrially scalable. So hence, my desire to work with menstrual blood and tissue culture, because can you foresee a future where the biotech industry is, even though, it's non-invasive and it's cruelty-free and it's sustainable, can you foresee a future where the biotech industry is going to actually produce meat from menstrual blood? It's not going to happen. It's too...
Not in our lifetime, for sure.
It's too taboo. And so, very much designing this project and these experiments with this in mind, to critique this product-based capitalist drive that is within the biotechnology field.
Within every field, en plus, this capitalist drive, this do, make something that you can sell.
And I've always resisted in exactly the same way in my art practice, even before I began working in biotechnology. I always made ephemeral works that would disappear into the environment, works that I could abandon in places for people to find, non-collectible works that would not sit on a shelf in a museum, because I wasn't interested in supporting the art industry in that way. So this has informed my thinking with merging, art and new media, biotechnology and science.
Before that, though, can you just say one more time that for you, the process is more important than the product? I think that's so important to underline and underscore, especially for our listeners who aren't necessarily the art lab, science, tech, postmodern genius that you are, that they don't have to be, that the making is more than what is made. Can you just talk about that for like 30 more seconds? Because I think that's, again, such an important message for our listeners to hear, that just the making.
Right. So I have a background as a craftsperson, and craft, other than its beautiful association with witchcraft, craft itself is very much focused on technique. And technique is mastered and refined through repeating process. So this has instilled in me giving precedence to the process of making, that creative process where the materials are speaking to you. And, if you're receptive and you listen, then they will sort of indicate to you how they want to be formed.
They will provide their own desire path, if you will.
They will. and cells will do this too. Cells act according to their, I guess we could call it desire if we want to anthropomorphize them a little bit. So always in my work, I have privileged process over product. And in fact, I'm really not interested in the product at all. I'm not interested in an object-based practice. I'm interested in the magic that's happening in that process of listening to the materials, allowing for the agency of more than humans to enter into your craft. And I think that this is where my art practice converges quite a bit with witchcraft and magic, beyond all of the feminist reckoning of elitism in the art world, it is that magic that is inherently anti-capitalist. It is that practice and that being with the materials and my process that privileges that over what capitalism tries to tell us we need to do with art, or we need to do with our ideas, or we need to do with innovation, produce a product that can be sold for profit.
Yeah, so even the idea of ideas must be exploited and put up for sale.
Exactly. So deviance, it's interesting because my introduction to the world of science was fostered through art science collaborative residencies. So I would go into a lab as an artist in residence. In the lab, I would collaborate with a scientist, and we would work together and generate new ideas and, create sort of artifacts, I guess, of the processes that we shared. There is a tradition of artists being brought specifically into labs, not only labs, but also research centers and even corporations, for the sole purpose of disrupting the environment. That disruption, that so-called, deviant behavior, was then actually appropriated as an innovation, but then sort of nestled within a capitalist framework and used to sort of generate new products. So I'm looking at, and I'm interested in, I'm thinking about artists, specifically feminist artists, who are very assertively embracing new scientific technologies, but in order to gain the upper hand against capitalism. And so some of these contemporary artists really are reveling in the shape-shifting witch as a natural fit for transdisciplinarity. And this is, if I can sort of use witchy language for a second, the transmogrification of knowledge and principles through making methodologies strange. And so a methodology is just a known way of doing things.
What we in the witch world would call a ritual.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what happens when you make a scientific methodology strange? And so these witches are similar in a way, but very distinct from the artists who I mentioned, who've been invited to infiltrate these industrial tech settings in order to instigate disruption for the sake of innovation. The witch is distinctly post-capitalist in her intentions. And so this is imagining the future without capitalism, beyond capitalism, after capitalism, because we all know that capitalism is collapsing. And so
watch it burn. I hope I live to burn.
Yeah, so the difference here is that, these supposed creative collisions with scientists so far have not necessarily challenged any capitalist paradigms, but they've sort of digressed to rejoicing in the inclusion. Witches are very much accustomed to stirring the pot without or in opposition to the requirement for this patronizing legitimacy. So we therefore very readily recognize the trap of capitalist inclusion, and that is one of appropriation. And there are so many cases of this happening. And we might even surmise that those who have been deemed as witches, or those of us self-identifying as witches, have been squinting skeptically at capitalism since its very inception. And this is what Sylvia Federici talks about quite a bit in her book. And so contemporary biotech witches have determined to, instead of being vexed, do the vexing. And so this is where we can talk a little bit about gynapunk.
Yes, this is something that you brought up in that interview that we did in the lab, and I went on a tear reading about Gynapunk. Can you refresh our listeners?
So Gynapunk is a collective. They're a Spanish collective. They have been dubbed the cyborg witches of DIY gynecology. So that should tell you a lot right off the bat. The cyborg witches title comes from Donna Haraway. And Donna Haraway wrote a text called the Cyborg Manifesto. And so this has sort of really informed a lot of techno-feminist thinking. So Gynapunk consider themselves to be auto-exploration experts within the context of body decolonization, glandular heresy,
glandular heresy. Yes, go on.
I love them so much.
Yeah.
Abortive acalar, and I know I'm not pronouncing that right, but it's a Basque term that means witch's Sabbath. Gang partners, spilled placenta, hacked biolabs, and self-managed labs. And they also identify as anarcha-glam. So I think this might apply to backwash as well, anarcha-glam.
Yes, glamorous anarchy. I love that.
So they are very much interested in deliberately rejecting this legacy of European colonization of women's, queer, and other bodies that's been carried out through legislated and moral suppression. So they're a little bit my heroes.
Yes, hallelujah.
Yeah, I have them in mind. They're very much inspiring my current research, and I'm working within very similar frameworks with my simple, very, very simple act of growing cells in menstrual blood. Let's think about that for a minute. That it should be a no-brainer, right?
Mm-hmm. Non-invasive, easy to access.
I mean, the whole reason menstrual blood exists is because it sort of lines the uterus.
It's nourishing,
to do what?
right? Yeah.
To do what? To grow cells.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I have heard some arguments being made that the entire apparatus of the biotech laboratory is meant to try to replicate a uterus. You have the biosafety cabinet, which is essentially the uterus.
Mm-hmm.
It's the uterine sac, let's say. The biosafety cabinet is the uterine sac. It is a sterile environment, although there's new research that suggests that, of course, the uterus is, or the uterine sac is not sterile. It contains microbes, but they're beneficial and they're necessary. You have incubators within a lab. You have antibiotics that are used in all tissue culture. This is another sort of criticism that I have of the promotion of lab-grown meat, actually, is that it's all grown with antibiotics. So the antibiotics are used because there's no immune system. There are no white blood cells in the petri dish with the tissue that is growing there. So antibiotics are used. There are all of these components that attempt to replicate the ideal conditions for growing cells into tissue, and that is exactly what a uterus does. So there's a whole discussion that can be had there. I'm certainly not against it. I think that biotechnology has fascinating possibilities for all bodies. So that's the beauty of it. But, from a feminist perspective, critiquing capitalist goals, we need to sort of look at how that disembodied pseudo-uterus apparatus is being used to support capitalism.
And how we can help to dismantle that.
Or at least have critical thought about it, so that when someone says, woohoo, lab-grown meat, get in line at the supermarket, everybody, it's coming to a freezer near you, and you don't have to kill any more cows. instead of being so desperate for solutions that are going to save the world, we need to slow down this accelerationist thing that's going on and think about what all the implications are and what are we not being told, and do more research and be anti-capitalist.
So what other how can our listeners enact all of this, all of your philosophy in their daily lives outside the lab and just in the world?
Well, I mean, technology is also our friend. We have, through the internet, access to many scientific papers. You can go on Google Scholar. You can search any topic. You can find PDFs of scientific papers on various topics. There are many now on lab-grown meat. And do your own research and don't just take at face value what you're being told by a corporate entity. And, that's what these startup companies are essentially. They're now worth billions of dollars. It needs to be dissected a little bit. I think, there are a lot of vegans who are hoping for a solution to end the cruelty that's in the meat industry. And I'm certainly not in support of the meat industry. I am in support of sustainable meat production that's on a small scale and that's local, but I am not in support of industrial anything. So I guess, if we can, for a moment, set aside our most passionate ideals to do the research, to really dig very, very deep into this topic and look at all of the different perspectives that are being presented through the research that's being done, we're going to see the problems start to come to the surface. And really, that's the only way that we can go forward in an informed manner that will allow us to change our patterns of behavior that are destroying the earth. Does that make sense?
Yes. Instead of rushing toward capitalism's innovation and fixology that you're talking about.
Fixology, that's a beautiful word.
That we need to slow down and think before we just buy into capitalism's version of what we should be doing next.
Exactly. Beautiful.
Yeah.
Think about what you're buying into. Yeah. There are a lot of people who are interested in conscientious consumption, and that's great. It's just that we have been so generationally brainwashed to think that we can't question scientific authority, that an area like new capitalist biotech developments get passed off as truths.
Yeah.
Without being questioned.
And we've been led to believe that the solution to any given problem is another product. There's a product for that. It's not like I saw this, I don't know if it was a New Yorker cartoon or whatever, but it was a person who had hung their laundry on a laundry line outside, and they were saying to their neighbor, it's the latest in solar and wind power, and so it's
there are so many things, there are so many examples that we could talk about
that are just the opposite of a new product that's going to save us all.
Right. And it's not going to be a product that's going to save us all. It's going to be community.
Yeah. So do you have any last messages for our listeners, how to go boldly and furiously and creatively as you have into the future, how to harness their own witch scientist?
How about if I say that I really hesitate to present myself as the authority on anything, because it goes back to authority, authorship, professionalization, and this sort of compartmentalized categorization that's dividing up the world. And I just wish for everyone to do their own research and make their own decisions and be their own authority, right?
I think that that's perfect and completely in line with my ethic as a podcaster. I really, really, really am just so fascinated by your work. I know that you're going to keep us posted on where this project goes and how it manifests and where this journey takes you. I really, really appreciate you taking time out of your jet setting to sit down and tell me about your project and talk to me about fucking anti-capitalism and smashing patriarchy.
Yes. Let's call it post-capitalism. That's my hopeful perspective. Post-capitalism, because capitalism is over.
It's done. And so is this episode. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. So yeah, I won't take any more of your time, but thank you so much. Thank you so very much.
I'm all about it. I think that, of all of the witchy sort of information that we're now being flooded with, this is some of the most thoroughly researched and intelligent and politically astute information that people are getting through the podcast. I'm serious.
I mean,
It's so important. It's so important because there are so many new young witches that are coming onto the scene and are just sort of being sucked into all of the objects and identity around what it means to be a witch without quite having access to all of the information about the politics behind it. And I think, yeah, you're just like covering the full range. It's amazing.
And I mean, we've had listeners reach out to us specifically because of your invitation to the lab. So it's definitely
Sweet.
I mean, Vanessa, we didn't even get to talk about Vanessa, but yeah, her first DM to me was just like 12 exclamation points. She listened to your episode in the lab and just sent me a bunch of exclamation points.
Oh my God. I loved listening to her interview. I was just like the whole time I was like, yes, oh my God, yes.
Yeah, she's wonderful. And she just, I mean, it was so magical. She's living in China, but is from Quebec, happened to be in Montreal this summer.
Oh, wow.
Rented a car, drove out to the country. I mean, it was all super magical, and it's all thanks to you and us. And what happens when we collaborate is so fucking alchemical.
I love it.
The alchemy of collaboration is like, it's turning dust into gold.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that would be another whole podcast in and of itself, the magic of collaboration. Yeah.
We'll have you back next season for sure for our collaboration special.
You must be a witch.